Hello and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Charlie Galvin, and with me today is Joe McKnight. Joe, this is a very real pleasure for me.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me too, Charlie.
You have such a long history here and so many recollections and reminiscences that I'm going to let you do the talking, but let me just give a quick background on Joe.
Well, we've been together for a long time.
That's correct. Joe is from San Angelo, Texas. Family were early settlers in that area. Joe did a BA at the University of Texas at Austin, and then a BA, a BCL, and an MA at Oxford, and then an LLM at Columbia Law School. He practiced law in New York for a period of time and then decided he wanted to teach and wanted to come back to Texas. And contact was made by Dean Robert G. Story, and Dean Story invited Joe to come in 1955, and he's been here ever since. He's had many experiences in many different directions, and Joe, I'm going to let you decide which you'd like to talk about first. You have the experience of teaching, the courses, an early connection with our very well-known legal clinic. You are a legal historian. You have a great influence on the development of the family code for Texas, and you pick it.
Well, let's just start off where it started. After the first year I was at SMU, like all beginning teachers, or most beginning teachers, I'd never taught before. The very first morning I taught a class in agency, which was a course we no longer have, but it was a course, in, as you and I know, in principal and agent law,
Right.
and which we discontinued years and years ago and have incorporated in another course in which it is oftentimes ignored, as far as I can tell. I wouldn't say that it's necessary to have it as a full course, but some inkling of it would be good to have in the curriculum.
That's true.
But that same semester, we were all teaching at that time 3 courses. And we were teaching in the good old then way of teaching 6 days a week. That is, we taught Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday mornings.
That's right.
And pedagogically, it seems to me that makes a whole lot more sense. That is, we're never going to turn back the clock to teaching in Saturday mornings. But if you have exposure to students on 3 days a week in each course, it seems to me that pedagogically that's a great deal more sound. I think maybe I wasn't required to teach but maybe 2 courses that very first semester. Now we start off much more gently.
Oh yes, yes indeed.
But I think I taught perhaps 2 courses. I taught a course in Texas family property law, and a course in agency right at the very first. 8 o'clock Monday morning, first day I taught. As time went on, my course load it varied a good deal, and of course in those days, that is from my start here and from 55 until 69, when we phased out the evening division, all of us taught both in the day and the evening.
That's right.
And although we'll be starting the evening division again this fall, and what I think some of my colleagues don't quite realize is there are some problems in keeping the standards together. I think, for example, that it's very important that the same people teach the same courses to the day and evening students. That way they can perceive what differences there are and adjust to those in their marking standards, which we worried about, you remember, a whole lot.
Oh yes indeed we did.
In those times. That is, evening marks, if they were left on their own, would be higher in those days than day marks, because they were graded by the class, and if the people weren't the same teachers, then the top grades would be A's perhaps, although in those days we didn't give very many of those to anybody. Mm-hmm. That is, B minus was a very good grade in those days. That's somewhat below average now. But
we call it grade inflation.
Grade inflation is exactly what it is. Well, that's not what that is to say, our younger colleagues call it.
They're really smarter.
They're smarter.
Yeah.
Well, they do perhaps have better opening marks in lots of respects. Mm-hmm. That is, they come with higher standards of education in many instances, but by no means all. And they have admissions tests, which I forget. I don't think there was any standard admissions test in the 50s, was there?
Not in the 50s, no. It pretty much was your
college
degree, or in those days we even had the 3-and-3 program.
Yes,
where you finished your undergraduate in the first year of law school, and you got the BA or BS, and then you got your law degree after you finished law school.
After two more years.
Yeah, right.
Well, you took all 3 years in the law school, but you could finish all of it in 5, right? Rather than
yes, that's right.
6.
That's right.
But that worked pretty well.
Well, really, 6 rather than 7, because you do 4 and 3 now.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
and
six,
so we did
6 rather than 7.
6 rather than 7, because the final year of the undergraduate was the year that you spend in law school.
Yes. Well, to go back to the way we scheduled courses, of course, in those days, we did have 2-credit courses and 3-credit courses, and the 2-credit courses were usually scheduled for Tuesdays and Thursdays, mm-hmm. and then if there were 3-credit courses, they met on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays.
That's right.
Whereas the other 3-hour or 3-credit courses met on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
That's right. That's right.
In those days, by those ancient days, I mean in the 50s and 60s, there weren't nearly as many students who did very much work on the outside.
That's true. That's true.
It didn't mean that we were discouraging them particularly. It's just that there wasn't work available.
That's true. That's right.
And I think the profession hadn't really realized that law students could do anything but keep water in the water cooler at that time. Although I think they've realized now that there's a great deal which law students can do in the way of helping professionals.
Absolutely, and they do.
And they do.
They certainly do.
Well, my initiation to teaching was in that first year in '55, and I still see some of my first students of that very first morning at 8 o'clock on Monday morning when I started to teach that course in agency. And they remind me, not overtly at how bad I was, but I know that I was. And it was a while. I would say it took 2 or 3 years before one got up to speed in teaching courses.
It's true.
That one had never done it before, until one got really decent at it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's a point at which one learns so much about one subject that one doesn't remember that the students don't know anything at all.
Yes, that's true.
And there's a great tendency to go too fast.
That's true, very true. Well, now, Joe, besides teaching, you have many other accomplishments, and the family code in Texas is certainly one of them. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I had been teaching family property law, that is our course, which we usually call Texas Matrimonial Property Law.
And you still do.
And still do.
Yeah.
I had begun teaching that because I liked taking the course at Austin under Professor Huey, and I'd become particularly interested in it. Mm. And I taught it every year. Not then twice, but just once. But in fact, we taught it in the summertime. It was part of the required summer curriculum in those days. We had 3 courses in the summer, and that was one of them. So I taught it every summer. So I got a double dose of it. And some years I would teach it once in the long semester and once in the summertime. That is, some students, especially the evening students, took it in the evening during the long semester. But the course was a mess because the law was a mess. The Texas law hadn't been properly codified in any way, really, back in the 50s and 60s. And we really needed some changes. Professor Eugene Smith, who had been one of my students who started the very first year in '55, the same time I started teaching, and I would talk a great deal, especially when he began teaching. He taught the course usually in the day, and I taught it in the evening, and we switched back and forth. We were both very, very irritated with the state of the law. That is, because it didn't fit together well. And we began thinking about, well, ways that we could improve on the law of family property, and just doing a little bit of private drafting ourselves. And we would get together as often as not in his office rather than in mine, and I'm talking about 62 or 3. And Gene had graduated in '58 and had become an assistant to Jack Ream, who was a dean at that time. And then he was assigned in the early '60s to teach the course, and we were terribly frustrated with the state of the law. So we began working on that part of it, gearing it up to the same numbers in the statute as it had, and changing it around and talking about the effect of words and trying to use them with some considerable care, although I'd never drafted any statutes before. And we, by 65, by '65, we began to feel that we had something in fairly decent shape. Actually, we began talking about what we were accomplishing to some of our friends in the bar. Well, the bar about that time took a referendum of all of its members on how the members of the profession felt about the Equal Rights Amendment, that is, the equal rights for women. And the vote went disastrously for the proponents. That is, 2/3 of the bar said we didn't want any such change, that it was unnecessary. But the women's groups, particularly the business and professional women's clubs, adamantly set out to begin defeating those legislators who shared this view with the preponderance of the bar. The bar, on the other hand, felt that it had a duty to do something about the law. That is, the advocates of the Equal Rights Amendment wanted to do it by constitutional amendment. The bar's view was that all this could be fixed quite adequately without doing it by the Constitution, by doing it by statute. Well, the pressure on the legislature had become so considerable by the time of the '65 legislative session that the bar decided that it needed some help, and they had heard that we were doing some work on something. And they asked Gene and me if they could introduce our bill as a demonstration that this can be done by legislation. We'll just pass this law, and won't be anything needs to be done about Constitution anymore. Actually, if the constitutional amendment had passed at that time, it would have had horrible, catastrophic effects, both with respect to family property law, which was far from equal, as you know, in those times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And criminal law, that is, especially the sex crimes, which were all, or for the most part, unequal. Interestingly, the criminal lawyers as well as the family lawyers were thinking about all of this at the same time. And the upshot of it all was that our state bar bill that was introduced in the legislature on the basis of the work that Gene and I had done to recodify the statute actually passed one house of the legislature at the '65 session, but died in the other house at the end of the session. Just as well, of course, because it wasn't really finished. But of course, it was a lot more finished than a lot of legislation that passed all the time.
Now, is that when Louise got into it on the next round?
Louise Raggio was very active.
One of our distinguished alumna.
One of our distinguished alumna and a prominent practitioner of family law in Dallas.
Right, yeah.
Louise at that time was the new chair of the family law section of the state bar. And she felt that this shouldn't stop there. Now, the bar, having released the legislature from the threats of the women's clubs, would have probably done nothing. Louise managed to talk the bar leaders, though, into going forward. That is, we'd gone some distance with the '65 session, and so we asked for a commitment from the state bar to go forward, and to make this a bar project, which the board of directors of the state bar finally acceded to, but they didn't have any money. We suggested that we would start the project's operation here at SMU, and it was centered there throughout the whole of the development. It was a statewide program, but it was all centered here. I became the director. We still had no money, of course, and I still taught a full load of courses because we were short in faculty. By modern standards, we had just about half what we have today.
Yeah, right.
But we geared up. We managed to raise some money from some charitable foundations, and the charitable foundation's money was used to pay for our expenses, and we got the law school to let us use, and I suppose were you dean at that time in 65, 7 if you were, weren't you?
Yeah.
Well, we talked you, I suppose, into
Shook me out of something.
to letting us hire a part-time secretary.
Yeah.
And the part-time secretary that we hired taught or worked half-time with the legal clinic and half-time with the Family Code Project. As we got into it, we got more money from some of the charitable foundations, and we had a bill ready, the outgrowth of the bill of '65, ready for enactment in '67. Over that time, we had an enormous number of meetings of the family law specialists throughout the state. We wrote 7 complete drafts with a commentary before we were through. That is, it went through that many stages of refinement. And one legislator paid us the nice compliment of saying it really was the best drafted statute that had ever been enacted during the time he was in the legislature.
You had a favorable governor who helped in this area.
Well,
was it not Allred, or was it?
No, it was after Jimmy Allred's time.
Was it Connolly, or there's some?
I suppose it was Connolly.
Connolly,
yes.
Helped.
Connolly looked upon the project. It was a modernization.
Yeah.
And he stood for that,
yeah,
that sort of
yeah.
thing. We were in the need of a whole lot of modernization
Yeah.
at that time, but we were moving ahead. Actually, at exactly the same time, Paige Keaton at Austin headed the project to do the same thing to the Texas criminal law.
I remember that. Yeah.
In fact, the overall result of the Family Property Act of 1967, the same group kept together and brought out a family code in '69, recodifying the '67 effort, along with some other things, and then continued to work, that is, all the law of husband and wife. We still hadn't done the law with respect to parent and child. That didn't come along until the early '70s. But by the time we had done all of that, and the penal law had been completely reformed, it was indeed time to enact the Equal Rights Amendment, because it wouldn't cause any chaos. It was what everybody believed in anyway.
Right.
And the result was that the Equal Rights Amendment passed handily. I suppose it was the election of '72. I think it was the election of '72 or '73. But by that time, we were well into the family code business in Texas. Really, a more thoroughgoing code than probably any other state had at that time.
I was going to say, and as you look at it today, it is a major compilation of all the rights and duties belonging to not only between spouses, but parents and children, and you're still adding to it.
And we're still adding to it. Sometimes I have the feeling that we're adding to it with too much detail. After all, judges really get an awful lot of experience and know how to do this themselves without being told by the legislature.
Yeah, that's true.
They have good judgment, which they ought to bring to bear on these issues without being hemmed in by statutes in every instance.
There still is, of course, a section of the State Bar of Texas.
There is,
and still interested and still working.
And I'm going to a meeting tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
There you go.
And I will talk to the people around about how they feel about the last legislative effort, which was made at the regular session last year, and will doubtless have some more meddling by the legislature in the spring of next year. But there have been some family code revisions in '99, in 2001, 2003, and each time it gets a little better than last time, but that's not really a very satisfactory way to draw legislation.
That's true.
Our legislation, I'm very proud to say, was the product of an enormous amount of man hours and woman hours put in by the family bar.
And you went all over the state, really,
We
sell it.
We went all over the state, selling it to
lawyers.
the practitioners.
Yeah, right.
We did meet with some resistance, of course. I had one lawyer who said, "Now, Joe, I like you, but I don't like everything you've done." He said, "You just repealed my legal education." But actually, what we've come with now is a much better system.
It's a wonderful accomplishment, and you're to be given all kinds of credit, along with, as you say, many others who put in
enormous
man
number
hours
of
and women hours in putting it together. Joe, you were an early clinician. I remember this so very well. SMU Law School distinguished itself by establishing a legal clinic to help those who couldn't afford the services.
Actually, Bill Masterson had started this, our legal clinic, for giving legal services to the poor. in 47, long before I arrived.
That's true, that's true.
And we therefore had one of the earlier legal clinics in legal education.
That's right.
And it had been going on very well with no full-time director, but a part-time director, and the trials were conducted by members of the bar downtown who would help the students. But we hadn't gone nearly as far as what is known today as the student practice rule. That is, allowing students to get a sort of junior bar card to entitle them actually to perform. But many judges would allow the students to argue.
Yes, we did have, that was important. We had the cooperation of the bar and we had the cooperation of the courts.
Yes.
And this permitted us to really branch out and do a lot, which was really in its infancy stages at that time.
And, you know, it doesn't make an awful lot of difference whether the student is addressing a jury in the justice court or in the district court, or whether he or she is arguing to a justice of the peace, or for that matter, a municipal judge. It's that experience of getting up and addressing the court on your feet that's important.
That's right, that's right.
And it takes that edge off when you first go into practice.
Yes, it does. How many are involved in it today? And I don't mean students now, but how many staff have we involved?
Now we have several full-time
clinicians,
staff members who have exactly the same standing as any other member of the faculty.
Yeah.
As I think there are three of us that now participate in two for the civil clinic, one for the criminal clinic, plus some part-time people in both, plus another practitioner who devotes part of his time to teaching and working with the tax clinic.
Yeah.
And then we have an immigration clinic, and there's a great deal of activity. And this is regarded today as simply part of legal education.
Absolutely, and a very important part, and recognized as such by the bar. Joe, I don't want time to run out here.
No, but let me add one thing about the clinic.
Yeah.
One of the most important public services I think that our clinic rendered was that of demonstrating locally that the poor really did need legal assistance, and that would not cut in on the finances of any practicing lawyer.
Yeah.
These people simply can't afford legal assistance, and therefore they felt shut out of the legal system. And we demonstrated that by setting up a clinic which we operated at the housing project out on Hampton Road. And it worked very well, and the bar accepted that lesson, and now has been behind a much more active clinic operation throughout North Texas.
I was in on the original formation of the legal services of North Texas,
yes,
which now is well established and well recognized. But those were rough days in the beginning because everything was very suspect as to what's happening here. This was the socializing of the profession, and
but as
it all worked.
Know, lawyers are very conservative people.
Oh yes, that's right.
Their ways don't change fast.
That's right. But fortunately, it has established, and I think the law school clinic was a very important part of the establishing a faith in what was going on.
I think so.
Now, Joe, legal history has been a major interest of yours. You've written extensively on the influence of the Spanish law. You're now speaking of the work you're doing in the European law of adoption and the history of that as it came over into this country. Tell us legal history, and you're doing a legal history project for the State
Bar.
Bar
Yes.
Historical Society to put together the history of that court as it functioned both during the days of the Republic and on after, to put it down so that it isn't just lost in memory at some future time. Tell us about that.
We have a Texas Supreme Court Historical Society, which has as one of its principal concerns a writing of the history of the court. And I've been directing that project, and we have a dozen authors who are at work on it, each one taking a different period in the development of the court. We're hoping that most of that work will be done next year, finished by next year. Then, of course, the terribly heavy work of the editor sets in. I've got to, with the help of several others, try to smooth it out so that it all sort of seems it's coming from the same source, stylistically and in form and the rest of it. But it's a difficult project, and it's never been done before in Texas.
That's right.
A few other states have attempted it. Some have simply hired historians to write such histories. Well, that they have written some very good ones, except they don't have the flavor of lawyering about them.
That's right.
They're not lawyers, and they don't know how the bar operates. And so what they say is true enough, but it doesn't give the whole picture. What we're trying to do is to write a history of our Supreme Court from the point of view of how the judges as lawyers work, that is, the work of the court for the people of Texas, and how the lawyers operate within the system. And that's our principal concern. This work will end up with 2 volumes. One volume will be the work of the court, and the second volume would be the biographical sketches of the judges, so that they don't get in the way of the rest of the book. And it's moving along very well. Now, my interest themselves in legal history, I have always been interested in legal history since the training I had at Oxford. I started out initially teaching English and Anglo-American legal history here at the law school, which was one of our first-year courses. It was a kind of legal method or legal institutions course. I raised the intellectual level of it somewhat, to the consternation of a lot of students. And a lot of them called it legal mystery and said that they never solved it. But it did give them a sort of grounding in the system.
Well, that's great.
And then about the same time, we founded the American Society for Legal History, and which I served as the first vice president and then as a member of the council for a number of years, and I'm still quite active in. The legal history throughout the country has become more significant now than it used to be. That is, there is literature on the subject, which there didn't used to be.
The court, as you look at it, the Supreme Court of Texas, is a court of great responsibility, a state of great size and great population. How do you react or feel about the question of election as appointment? Do you have, as you review biographies and look back over its time,
I think that both systems have fatal flaus, and by fatal I don't mean absolutely fatal, but they slow down the heartbeat of both systems. And one of them is that the elective system, you can oftentimes get hacks, political hacks. Especially when you're electing a large court that has 9 members.
Yes.
People who have experience on the judiciary are not necessarily equipped to be Supreme Court judges, because their understanding may need to be somewhat broader. On the other hand, if the appointive system works properly, it would be better. it seems to me. But it doesn't always. In fact, you and I can think of dozens of instances in which governors or presidents appoint people to the Supreme Court either to remove them as possible opponents in the political scene or simply for some political reason.
Pay off political debts.
Pay off political debts.
That's right.
Therefore, it's really substituting one political system for another, and it seems to me that both have flaws. If we could be assured that the appointive system would be exercised really responsibly, it seems to me that that's a superior system. But who's to check?
Yeah, yeah.
And the legislators, of course, are political animals, and they tend to follow along with whatever political scheme, provided they are in general tune with the governor.
We've had a lot of turnover in the court in recent years. We used to think of justices on the Supreme Court as being there for a while.
For permanence.
But they're coming on the court and then leaving and running for other office. And so there's a lot of turnover, which takes away some of the institutional memory that's important.
That's very true, and it takes a while after there's been a big turnover, as there has been in recent years on the Texas Supreme Court, within the last few years. Yeah. It takes a while before the court learns to operate as a unit.
Exactly.
Now, they don't always agree, but they do know how to operate together, and it takes time to achieve that. And it's unfortunate, I think, that judges do go off, and obviously, in many instances, some judges may tire of it. It's very hard work.
Oh, sure it is.
And others may feel that they can better provide for their families and going back into practice.
That's true. That's very true. And of course that does happen.
And the pay of Supreme Court justices is not generous.
No, it isn't. It's better than it was, but
it's vastly better than it was, but it's still not robust.
Joe, back to legal history, and you've mentioned about working on the history project for the Supreme Court, very important project. Your interests have been the influence in the past of the Spanish law on Texas law. Tell us a little bit more about that.
The Spanish were here, of course, before the English speakers arrived.
Yeah.
There weren't very many of them, but they had put down roots of a governmental and a legal system. One of the most remarkable things to me is how much about law those immigrants who were farmers for the most part, and soldiers, how much they really knew about the system as it operated and had just picked up by word of mouth, in the same way that Anglo-Americans understood how the jury works. The Spaniards understood certain rules of law that you just had to do it that way, even though they were unlettered and not always, in no sense, educated people. But I was interested and am interested in this, how our system developed with these two components of Spanish law and Anglo-American law, particularly from my interest in family property law, which in Texas is a very big increment of the surviving elements of Spanish law.
Absolutely.
And because that is a particular subject of interest to me, I began working on that on that regard, and have done a certain amount of writing on the Spanish elements in Texas law, and shortly I'll be bringing out some more work on the Spanish law as it has affected the law all across the United States, from Florida all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Very good, very good.
And it hasn't been a very profound effect because it's largely, curiously enough, confined to inheritance law and things related to inheritance law. As you know, we think of the community property law today as being a part and parcel of divorce law. Well, in the 19th century, there weren't any divorces to speak of, and people who got them were frowned upon very severely. In fact, there weren't really very many divorces in Texas per capita until after World War II.
That's true.
And the stigma still attached until that time of people who were divorced. Divorce is a new thing, really, in our time, but its relationship of property was mainly it was the Spanish way of taking care of the surviving spouse that Anglo-American law did in a different way. But therefore, its big impact throughout the United States, where it put down roots, has been in the law of inheritance and succession and providing for the survivor.
And of course, in titles, it's fascinating to go back to those old original Spanish grants and the terms, the leagues and labors that were used to describe.
We do maintain that terminology.
We still carry that forward, yeah.
And in Texas and New Mexico, and to a lesser degree in Arizona and California, but still a very considerable degree in Louisiana, and not any in Arkansas or Missouri, a little bit in Mississippi, none in Alabama that I've been able to discover. There was some in Florida at one time, but it seems to have gone away. So the central area of the impact of Hispanic law in the United States is Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico. And that's and of course there is an increasing Hispanic population in those regions, although that really doesn't have anything to do with these legal consequences.
The evolution in California seems to have been somewhat different. It has the origins are the same, but it's grown up differently. Yes,
and California in 1849 lifted its definition of the subject and put it in its constitution verbatim out of the Texas Constitution. But it has softened over the years as more and more Americans came into California, and of course the Great Rush and the Gold Rush really changed the population there considerably.
Now, I want us to get to adoption because you've been studying some early history of the subject.
And it, of course, is an increment in our family code.
Absolutely, and now you've been teaching some European history.
Yes.
And the Europeans had to deal with the subject of adoption. How did they do it? Or did they do it at all?
Well, they adopted children hardly ever. That is, you adopted adults. For one thing, infant mortality was very high.
Yeah.
That is, you didn't adopt children because they might not survive infancy. You adopted proven people. If you wanted to carry on your family traditions and you're taking care of family lands and you didn't have any children of your own, you adopted an adult. Now, the principal candidates were, of course, relatives. If you had no relatives, you sometimes went outside. The church frowned on your adopting your own illegitimates. It cheapened marriage. That is, if you can have heirs who are not legitimate, it doesn't do anything for the institution of marriage.
That's a good point.
And so the church took a definitely negative attitude toward the adoption of illegitimate. So you had to look to your nephews and nieces and cousins, and and those were the usual beneficiaries of adoption. But in the old world view, it was rare that people adopted children, although some rural people did, just to help to work on the farm.
Now, you've mentioned that you've come across the use of case law in your dealings with European legal history.
Yes, for us
we
lawyers,
we were the ones that relied on
that's
case
right.
law.
For us lawyers, we have been taught since we first went into law school that those Europeans don't have case law that amounts to anything.
That's right.
We are the ones who have case law.
Right. That's
well, historically, that's really not true. The amount of case law that existed throughout the continent was large. That is, especially the papal court in Italy, which was staffed by extremely competent lawyers, the courts in France, the courts in Germany, the courts in Spain operated well enough, I think, but they didn't publish much in the way of decisions because the King of Spain said that's a waste of time. Get on with deciding the cases and don't spend all that time writing things down. But I suppose he thought that he could cut costs by not taking up their time writing decisions.
Well, now the course you're teaching, you find no lack of source material.
Well, there is a lack of source material in English.
Really? Yes.
Of European legal history. But there is a growing quantity of material in English. And it's being generated not only in this country, but in the English and Scottish universities.
Very good.
Which also offer such courses. Actually, as I see it, a course in legal history on the continent, European legal history, serves as an extremely good introduction to the way that foreign lawyers are trained. If in our relations with foreign lawyers, if we understand how they were educated, we've gone some way on understanding how they think. And I think for a lawyer who hopes to practice in the international field, that it's something he needs to know about. And I think it's popular in that respect.
Yes.
Because some lawyers do want to go into doing some international practice, and if you can talk to a lawyer whose education you understand both his strengths and his weaknesses.
Joe, we're about the end of our time here. What, as you look at the law school, and you've had so many years now, almost 50, just right short of 50, where do you see strength and weakness? What's your comment for the generation that will look at this 100 years from now?
Well, it seems to me that the school is vastly stronger when I first saw it in the mid-50s. But I think that all schools are stronger by our standards because we have tended to make those. We participated in making those standards for one thing.
That's true.
They measure up better now toward the way we think law schools should be. But the quality of admission standards, the quality of teaching is just better than it used to be. Now, I think there's been an incredible proliferation of student writing and student reviews and that sort of thing, which are not supervised very much by faculty. And the students learn a great deal by doing that work.
In this time of vast improvement in technology, do you see us doing distance teaching where students will learn from their homes a profession of law, or will we still come back to the classroom?
I think I think there's an awful lot to be said in legal teaching, though, of the give and take that the professor has with the students and the other students. Now, I do think, Charlie, that to say that putting 150 students in a room and asking 2 or 3 a few questions doesn't constitute legal education now, and it never did. But if you have smaller groups where there is more interchange, students can learn, properly guided by the professor, from each other, and everybody can share in the educational process. Now, I think there will be some long distance education. It'll probably be about as good as our system was about 50, 60, 75 years ago. And in some instances, maybe quite good.
And in this litigious society, do you see alternative dispute resolution as something we must do much more of, the rapid disposal of matters rather than these lengthy court trials, appeals and rehearings and so forth? Where do you see
it certainly should cut costs. It should give the opportunity for the public to settle their own disputes. There, you know, in the United States and Britain, there was a prevailing attitude, certainly of the 19th century, that lawyers all took the view, see you at the courthouse. That is, we don't want to talk to you about it. We're just going to present our witnesses in court, and we're going to trip you up if we can. It was a great game.
Yes.
Now, that has changed in very large measure, it seems to me. That is, we're trying to solve these disputes. Lawyers are, I think, far more humane than they used to be. They didn't really used to be that they didn't feel that they were inhumane, but the way they went about it didn't solve problems very fast. Now, economics make it really necessary to move these things along, especially since we have twice as many people with many, many disputes.
Joe, nobody has rung a bell here, but I think maybe
we've said all that we need to say for today. We can say something else some other time.
5 minutes? Well, we've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right.
Wrap it up in whatever.
Ask me another question, Charlie.
Turn the crank. Wrap it up in whatever way you'd like. Wrap it up in whatever any.
Well, I wonder what we haven't talked about. We have talked about the clinical program. We've talked about my interest in legal history and in family law.
Yes.
We haven't talked any about the law school itself.
Well,
except in a sort of oblique general way.
Yeah, and that wrap that up if you'd like.
Well, we've had a tremendous expansion.
Yes.
In legal education since World War II. And we have had lots more students, and in that any legal institution with limited facilities, that is in seats that for people to sit down in and numbers of courses people can take, you have to limit your intake of students significantly. We have better students all the time because we have a very selective process.
That's true. Better students, better faculty recruitment, better institutional operations. The law schools themselves have gotten so much better. What about ethics? What about ethics? Are we doing enough? We see the violation of ethical standards. What are we doing?
I have taught professional ethics on occasion, and I think that I agree with many other commentators who say that we can't really change a man or woman's ethics by the time we get them. That is, men and women in their 20s already have their ethical standards. All we can do is bear down hard on what the profession will tolerate. That is, and hope that some really will apply their good high standards to making the situation better.
Good point. Good point.
I think by and large the practice of law maintains a pretty high standard of ethics.
And the disciplinary processes, it seems to me, are better administered now than they were at an earlier time.
And it's there are two things these days that I look at when I pick up the Bar Journal monthly.
Yeah.
And one of them is the obituaries.
Obituaries, and the other is the disciplinary.
The other one is the disciplinary proceedings.
Right.
And I am particularly pleased to see that very few of the students I have taught, not that I have had anything to do with it, but simply that they have not been part of our university.
Mm-hmm.
Very few of those have been caught in the disciplinary process,
Mm-hmm.
and I like to think that perhaps that we are discharging our responsibility, at least as to some considerable degree, in the inculcation of ethical standards.
We hope they've learned at their mother's knee of what's right and wrong, but we've got to still impose strict disciplinary standards. Joe, I think they're signaling that we have ended.
Well, we'll be glad to come back some other time.
Welcome.
Thank you,
And
Charlie.
100 years from now, someone will play this tape.
If they are able, if their equipment is able to work that way.
That's right. A lot of equipment may not be able to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. That was very, very good. Very good.